Good evening, and welcome to Sleepless Horror. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whether you're lying in bed, listening through headphones, or simply drifting beside a quiet lamp, I invite you to settle in. Let the day fall away. Let your eyes grow heavy. The story is about to begin. But before it does, I have two small questions for you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I always find it comforting knowing how these stories echo across time zones, across dimly lit bedrooms, midnight cafes, long train rides, or tiny islands surrounded by sea mist. Tonight's story begins in the kind of place that doesn't appear on most maps anymore. A town called Bellmare. It's nestled between two forested hills and often hidden by fog. The kind of place where shopkeepers remember your name and the baker closes early on Thursdays. There are cobblestone streets, ivy-covered porches, and quiet corners where time seems to gather like dust. And at the center of town stands an old stone tower. Once, it was a clock. A proud, echoing thing that tolled every hour on the hour. Its chimes rang over rooftops and river banks, keeping time for all of Bellmare. But that was 70 years ago. One day, without warning, the clock simply stopped. No one could explain it. No storm had passed. No gear had snapped. The hands froze at exactly 3:17, and from that moment on, silence took its place. The tower grew cold, then forgotten. Children grew up hearing stories about it. Some say it's haunted. Others say the clock wasn't measuring time at all, but keeping something locked away. No one has tried to repair it in decades. Until tonight. You see, a man has just returned to Bellmare after many years away. His name is Elliot. He was only a boy when he left, but this town still remembers his family. His grandfather was the last person to care for the tower, the last to understand its hidden workings. Harold Remley, the clockmaker. His old workshop has sat untouched ever since, its windows clouded with dust, its front sign faded by rain. But tonight, a light flickers behind that window once more. Elliot stands in the doorway, turning a brass key in the lock. The door creaks open with the sound of wood that hasn't moved in years. And when he steps inside, and the smell of time greets him. Varnish, oil, iron, and age. Clocks line the walls, quiet and still. Grandfather clocks, pocket watches, chiming mantelpieces. All asleep, frozen mid-moment. Dust lies thick on the floorboards, and cobwebs trace the corners like ancient threads. Elliot exhales slowly. The air is cooler here. He sets down his suitcase beside a table littered with rusted tools and folded blueprints. He doesn't notice the box yet. The small wooden one tucked on a shelf behind the door, sealed shut with a strip of wax. He doesn't notice the whisper of gears high above, stirring in the dark. He simply closes the door behind him, and the bell over the door rings softly once, then falls silent. And at that very moment, up in the tower, where no one has climbed in decades, something shifts. A cog, a breath, a whisper of movement in the cold metal heart of Bellmare. After 70 years, the clock has begun to wake. The following morning, Bellmare awoke beneath a low-hanging fog. It clung to the treetops and drifted lazily between chimneys, softening the world like a half-remembered dream. The streets were quiet, save for the distant sound of a cart rolling over cobblestones and the call of a lone crow perched on a lamppost. In the upstairs room above the old clockmaker's shop, Elliot sat on the edge of a narrow bed, the floorboards cool beneath his feet. He hadn't slept much. The quiet had been unfamiliar. Not just the kind that comes with age or solitude, but something denser, like the air had been holding its breath all night long. Downstairs, the workshop remained exactly as he had left it the night before, frozen in time. He descended the staircase slowly, running his fingers along the rail. His grandfather's tools still hung neatly on the pegboard above the bench, though their edges had dulled with disuse. Clocks of every kind stared blankly from their shelves, their faces dusty, their hands still frozen. The large brass one by the door read 3:17, same as it always had, same as the clock tower. Elliot paused, eyes drifting to the old spiral staircase in the back of the shop. A narrow wooden door stood before it, closed and crooked on its hinges. Beyond it, the stairs wound upward into the stone tower, eventually reaching the great mechanism that once ruled Bellmare's time. He had stood there the night before, hand on the knob, unsure if he dared open it. Now, he simply looked and waited. A quiet knock came from the front door. Startled, Elliot turned. Few people even remembered this place, but when he opened it, he found a thin, elderly man bundled in a grey coat and scarf, his breath visible in the morning chill. "Mr. Remley?" the man asked gently, voice weathered with time. Elliot nodded. "I'm Elliot, my grandfather." "Harold was a good man," the old man interrupted with a kind, sad smile. "I'm Tom Callan. Used to run the bakery across the square. I saw the light last night." He stepped inside without waiting for invitation, glancing around the workshop with reverence, like a man entering a chapel. Place hasn't changed, even smells the same. Elliot watched him closely. "Did you know him well?" "Oh, we all knew him," Tom said. He was quiet, thoughtful, kept to himself mostly after the clock stopped. Elliot frowned. "Do you know why it stopped?" Tom hesitated, running a gloved hand along the edge of a long wooden case. "No one knows, really. But some folks say Harold stopped it on purpose." Elliot blinked. "On purpose?" He nodded. "They say it wasn't broken, just paused, like it was holding something back." Tom turned toward the tower door, and whatever it was, he didn't want it waking up. Elliot said nothing. The pocket watch he had found the night before still sat on the workbench, its cover closed. He hadn't touched it since. He hadn't dared. The old man started for the door. "I won't keep you. Just thought you should know. The night the clock stopped, the whole town heard one last chime at midnight, but no one was near the bell. No one pulled the rope." He paused at the threshold, eyes distant. "And since that night, no child in Bellmare has been born at 3:17. With that, he disappeared into the fog. Elliot stood in the quiet shop for a long moment, the whisper of gears and ghost stories curling through his thoughts like wood smoke. He turned slowly toward the tower door. Somewhere above, something had stirred, and deep within the walls of the town, time held its breath. The key turned in the lock with an uneven click, like old bones shifting in their sockets. Elliot stood before the narrow door at the back of the workshop, heart thrumming gently in his chest. It had taken him most of the morning to work up the nerve. After Tom Callan's visit, the air in the shop had changed. Not colder exactly, but heavier. The kind of heaviness that settled behind your eyes, the kind that remembered things. The stairs beyond the door spiraled tightly, their stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet. First the townsfolk, long ago, and finally his grandfather, who must have walked them alone for years. A thin string of light came from above, filtered through dust and cracks in the tower's shell. Elliot stepped through the door and began to climb, his hand trailing the wall for balance. With each turn, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of the outside world fell away. It felt like entering the hollow trunk of some ancient tree, damp, dark, and full of memory. At last, he reached the mechanism. The gear chamber stood open to the middle of the tower. A lattice of iron teeth, copper shafts, and wooden flywheels filled the space like the ribs of some sleeping beast. Dust lay over everything, but the layout remained pristine. Not a single part displaced, not a single cog rusted out. Elliot ran his fingers over one of the massive gears and paused. It was warm, not hot, not active, just not cold. Not like it should have been after 70 winters of silence. He moved slowly around the chamber, taking it all in. Charts and schematics had been nailed to the walls, most faded beyond reading. A small oil lamp sat dry on a corner shelf, and in the middle of the floor, just beneath the bell's hidden ropes, was something unexpected. A stool, simple, wooden, with a cushion flattened by time. Beside it, a notebook lay curled with age, its cover cracked, its spine barely holding. Elliot picked it up and opened the first page. In his grandfather's steady, slanted handwriting, a date, March 3rd, 1955, 3:17 a.m. The rest of the page was blank. He turned to the next. It won't let me sleep. The ticking is gone, but the sound still echoes in my chest, as if the tower remembers. Page after page followed. Notes, observations, drawings. More dates, many of them at 3:17 exactly. Some were crossed out, others were circled. One had only a single sentence, scribbled in frantic ink. If it wakes, time must be watched, not measured. Watched. Elliot sat back on the stool, the notebook resting on his knees. Through a gap in the stone above him, a shaft of pale light spilled down from the clock face. The glass was clouded with age, the hands still frozen. One on the 3, the other on the 17 mark, just past the quarter hour. He followed the line of the hour hand, tracing the hidden gears that controlled it. They led to a sealed compartment in the back wall, bolted shut with 4 brass latches and carved with a small circular sigil. Elliot had never seen that symbol before. A crescent cradling a dot, like an eye half closed. It made him uneasy. Still holding the notebook, he climbed the final ladder to the bell loft. Here, the tower opened up to the gray sky beyond. The great bell hung silent in its beams, the rope curled on the floor beneath like a sleeping serpent. He touched the bell's edge lightly with one finger. It rang. Not a full sound, just a soft tone as though the metal had remembered what it was made to do. Elliot stepped back, notebook to his chest, and looked out through the arched window over Bellmare. The town stretched below in quiet gray lines, the rooftops softened by morning mist. For a moment, it looked peaceful, still. But something deep inside him knew it wouldn't stay that way. His grandfather hadn't just built the clock, he'd kept watch over it, and now that duty had passed to Elliot. Back in the workshop, the late afternoon sun had crept in through the grimy windows, turning the dust in the air to gold. The light fell across Elliot's shoulders as he knelt beside his grandfather's old workbench, the scent of iron filings and oiled wood thick in the stillness. He had returned from the tower slower than expected, his mind weighed down with too many thoughts and one thin notebook. The pages continued to whisper to him even now. half-formed sentences and odd diagrams scratched in pencil, some of them drawn over and over again. The handwriting became messier as the dates grew older, as though Harold Remley had begun to lose his grip on something, or perhaps was holding on too tightly. Elliot placed the notebook gently beside the lantern and turned his attention to the drawers beneath the bench. There were 6 of them, each lined with velvet and filled with tools, awls, tweezers, gear pullers, loop lenses, tiny screwdrivers. Everything precisely placed. Nothing moved. Until the 4th drawer. It stuck at first, as though it hadn't been opened in decades. Elliot pulled carefully, and with a groan of swollen wood, it gave way. Beneath a curled measuring tape and several rows of miniature gears was a yellowed envelope, worn soft with time and sealed with red wax, unbroken. No stamp, no name, just one word across the front, written in deliberate black ink. Elliot. He stared at it for a long moment. The air in the room seemed to still. His grandfather had written this. There could be no doubt. He recognized the flourish on the T, the slanted lowercase e. The envelope was brittle and warm in his hands as he broke the seal with a slow breath. The letter inside was handwritten on thick paper, the ink slightly faded. My dearest Elliot, if you are reading this, it means you have returned, or been called, to Bellmare. I do not know what year it is. I do not know what the clock has become, but I know it will try to wake. You must not fix it, not as it is. The clock does not tell time, it contains it. It was built not to chime, but to hold, to keep the town safe from what the hours carry when they run unchecked. You must understand this. If the bell rings again, it will not mark the hour. It will open the door. There is more beneath the tower than stone and brass. There is memory, and something older than memory. Something that must never be allowed to finish ticking. I love this town, Elliot. I gave it everything. But the timekeeper cannot live forever. If the gears begin to stir, you must choose. Either silence the clock or watch it. Watch it every day, every hour. Never look away, because once it begins, it cannot be unwound. Be brave, my boy. H.R. Elliot lowered the letter slowly, his hands trembling slightly despite the stillness around him. Outside, the afternoon light began to shift. Not darker, but softer, stranger. As if the sun had slipped behind something that wasn't quite a cloud. And for a moment, just a moment, the tall grandfather clock by the front window gave a soft, metallic twitch. Its hour hand moved forward by a single minute, then stopped. The gears in the tower above did not move again, but Elliot felt them. Listening. Somewhere, time had turned a corner, and whatever had waited inside the silence had noticed. Evening crept in slowly, like fog spilling from under a locked door. The lamps in Bellmare lit one by one, yellow puddles of light in the misty streets, but none reached the windows of the clockmaker's tower. Elliot stood again at the foot of the spiral staircase, the sealed letter now folded neatly in his pocket. The silence in the room was deeper than before, as if something had withdrawn its breath and was waiting for his next step. He lit the oil lamp he had found in the tower earlier, its soft glow flickering against the stone walls. Shadows danced up the stairwell as he climbed. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just from the weight of his body, but from the weight of years, of stories half forgotten and warnings too gently whispered. The further he climbed, the more the air seemed to hum, like a pressure just beneath hearing. He reached the gear chamber again, and this time it felt less like a room and more like a mouth held open in the dark. The great brass cogs stood still in their frames, but he noticed something new. A faint groove in the floor where footsteps had passed again and again over time, all leading to the sealed compartment in the back wall, the one with the crescent sigil. The warmth he'd felt earlier near the gears had returned. Not heat exactly, more like a pulse, as though the mechanism beneath the floor were dreaming. He knelt beside the sealed panel, running his hand along the edges. The brass latches were tarnished but intact, and then he saw it, a tiny mark beneath the crescent, barely scratched into the metal. 3 digits, 317. Elliot drew back slowly. That time again. Always that time. It was the hour the tower had stopped, the time in the letter, the moment the clocks all paused and the town had held its breath. He stood, lantern in hand, and turned toward the narrow ladder leading to the bell loft above. This time, when he climbed it, the air felt colder, not from the wind, from something else, something that hadn't moved in a long time and resented the change. At the top, the bell loomed over him like a silent sentinel. Its iron surface was pitted with rust, but its shape remained perfect. A dark crown hanging in the silence. The rope dangled beside him, untouched. He stepped forward and looked out the open archway over Bellmare. The town below was mostly dark now. A few windows glowed. A cat darted across a rooftop. The mist pressed against the hills in slow waves, curling through the trees and edging closer. But something was off. He leaned further out. The clock face, seen from behind, looked as it always had. Stained, cracked, its hands unmoved. But when he glanced at the rim, he saw something impossible. Condensation, a faint fog from inside the glass, as if something had breathed on it. He stepped back sharply, bumping the lantern. Its light flared, then steadied. The air around him felt tighter now, less open, less alone. And then, from somewhere deep below in the hidden workings of the tower, came a sound. Just one. A faint metallic click. The kind of sound a clock makes when it turns over to a new hour. Except this clock was broken, and no one had touched it. Elliot held still, the bell towering silently above him. The fog outside pressed closer to the windows, thick and unmoving. It looked like smoke, but it didn't rise. He turned slowly, descending the ladder with care. As he passed the gear chamber, he paused. The stool had moved, just slightly. No more than an inch. But it was now facing the wall, as though someone, or something, had been sitting in it, watching. The next morning, the fog rolled in thicker than usual. It blanketed Bellmare in a pale hush, curling beneath windowsills and turning the familiar into the strange. Lamps flickered. Footsteps sounded distant. And somewhere above it all, the tower stood watching, unmoved but not forgotten. Elliot had barely slept. His mind wandered in circles, replaying the sound of that single mechanical click echoing up from the tower's belly. The stool that had moved, the breath on the glass, the notebook, the letter. The clock wasn't just broken, it was waiting. By midday, the fog had thinned enough for him to walk into town. He needed answers, or at least voices other than his own to fill the silence that clung to him since entering the tower. He needed someone who remembered. The smokehouse still stood at the edge of the square, tucked between the bakers and the chapel. Its windows were fogged, its walls stained with years of wood fire and time. Inside, The scent of salt and hickory lingered like an old song. It was more tavern now than anything, a place where Bellmare's oldest residents gathered at mismatched tables to talk about weather, memory, and things best left unsaid. The fire crackled low in the hearth as Elliot stepped inside. A few heads turned. Some recognized his face at once, not from memory, but by resemblance. He was a reflection of a man they'd known, shaped by years and grief. Clockmaker's boy, someone murmured near the fire. An older woman stood slowly from her table, leaning on a twisted cane. Her eyes were sharp beneath her grey curls. "I thought it was you," she said. "I'm Agnes Holling. I knew your grandfather." Elliot nodded. "I was hoping someone still did." Agnes motioned to a nearby seat. "Sit and tell me what you've seen." He told her everything, or nearly everything. The notebook, the letter, the seal on the compartment, the warmth in the gears, the ticking that wasn't there but somehow was, the stool that turned to face the wall. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a silver coin. She turned it slowly between her fingers. "Do you know what that tower was before it was a clock?" she asked. Elliot blinked. "It wasn't always a clock?" She shook her head. "Number before your grandfather, before his father even. That tower was something older. A watchtower first, they say. But some think it was a prison." "A prison," he echoed. "For time," she whispered, leaning closer. "Not just the kind that passes, but the kind that folds, loops, leaks. It's why nothing grows near the base of the tower, why birds never nest in the rafters, why Bellmare has no proper graveyard." Elliot frowned. "What do you mean?" Agnes looked toward the hearth. The flames flickered long and slow, like breath. "We don't bury our dead here," she said. "We burn them. Always have. Because in this town, things that lie still too long tend to rise when the clock stirs." The coin in her hand gleamed once in the firelight. Then she closed her fist around it. "When Harold stopped the bell, he did it to save us. But it cost him. You don't just silence the flow of hours without consequence." "What happened to him?" Elliot asked softly. Agnes's gaze drifted to the window, where fog pressed like fingers against the glass. "He stopped sleeping," she said. "He started hearing the chimes in his dreams, and by the end, he spoke in numbers, not words." She stood slowly, her cane tapping the wooden floor. "If the bell rings again, boy, you'd best not be standing beneath it." As Elliot left the smokehouse, her final words echoed in his thoughts like a quiet toll. And as he crossed the square, he noticed something strange. Every shop window reflected the tower, even the ones that shouldn't have. That night, the workshop was quieter than usual. Elliot sat beneath the single bulb hanging over the workbench, the rest of the room swallowed in shadow. Outside, the fog pressed against the window panes, thick and unmoving. The clocks still slept on their shelves, hands frozen, faces faded with dust. But somehow the silence felt crowded, as though it wasn't silence at all, but waiting. He lit the lantern and placed it beside the folded letter from his grandfather. The light flickered gently across the workbench, dancing over tiny tools and bits of brass. He had no appetite, no music, only questions. Elliot opened the notebook again. Harold Remley's careful, spiraling entries filling page after page. Diagrams of gear configurations, equations written and crossed out, and phrases that made less and less sense the further he read. Time must be tended. Every hour is a door. The ticking dreams. By midnight, Elliot could no longer keep his eyes open. He lay back on the cot in the upstairs room, the blanket pulled over him, the notebook still open beside him like a sleeping cat. The light dimmed to an ember, and he dreamed. He dreamed of gears, not polished or shining, but old, rusted, breathing. The tower stood above him, impossibly tall, stretching into a sky that had no stars. The clock face glowed from within like a giant eye, watching, waiting. In the dream, he stood at the foot of the tower, his hand pressed to the stone. It was warm. Behind the sealed compartment, something moved. Not gears, not metal, but something that turned like a thought, like the slow inhale of a forgotten name. The bell tolled once, and the sound shattered the world. The town split open like paper soaked in rain, houses folded in on themselves, trees curled backward into saplings, people walked in reverse, mouths moving silently, clocks spinning like frightened insects. The fog bled upward into the sky and the air thickened like syrup. Elliot tried to run, but the streets were gone. The tower leaned forward, casting a long, cold shadow. He looked up. The clock's hands had moved. 3:18. He woke, gasping. The room was dark. The lantern had long gone cold. But the ticking was real. Slow. Subtle. Not from the clocks on the shelves. Not from the pocket watch. But from below. From the tower. Elliot sat up slowly, his breath visible in the chill air. He turned to look at the staircase in the corner, just outside the workshop. The wooden door at its base was closed, but under the crack beneath it, a faint glow pulsed. Faint and golden, like candlelight, like someone was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Elliot stood at the threshold of the stairwell, the lamp in his hand, trembling slightly. The glow beneath the door was faint, golden and flickering, like candlelight spilled onto old stone. But no one else should be in the tower. Not tonight. Not ever. He knelt and pressed his ear to the wooden door. Nothing. No creaking, no footsteps. Just that faint hum again, that low rhythmic sound he'd begun to notice more and more. It wasn't quite a ticking, more like a heartbeat, muffled beneath layers of wood and time. He opened the door slowly. The hinges gave a soft groan and the air that drifted out smelled of wax, rust, and something older, something like rain on stone. The spiral stair waited, curling upward into shadow. But tonight, Elliot didn't stop at the gear chamber. He climbed past it. At the landing above, the clock face loomed pale in the gloom. From behind, the glass was clouded and fractured, the hands still frozen in place. Except, Elliot narrowed his eyes. The minute hand was different. Not much. Just a fraction, but it no longer pointed to the 17 mark. It was closer to the 18. The change was so slight that anyone else would have missed it, but not Elliot. He stepped closer to the back wall of the chamber. There, just as before, sat the sealed compartment, the one with the crescent sigil. Brass latches, 4 of them. He knelt beside it. Something was different here, too. There was a gap now. A thin line of air between the panel and the wall, as though the metal had shifted ever so slightly. He reached for the notebook in his coat pocket, flipping quickly to one of the earliest pages. A drawing. The compartment, the symbol, the latches. His grandfather had written one sentence beneath it. When it breathes, it loosens. Elliot looked back at the compartment. Is that what this was? He hesitated. Then, one by one, he began to undo the latches. They opened easily, too easily, with soft clicks that echoed like whispers. When the fourth latch came free, the panel opened slightly, revealing a dark interior just wide enough to slide a hand inside. Elliot reached in slowly. His fingers brushed fabric, software cold. Wrapped around something heavy, he pulled it free and unwrapped it carefully in the lantern's glow. It was a key. Iron, ornate. Its bow was shaped like a crescent curled around a small glass eye. The stem was engraved with numbers, tiny ones in a spiral pattern. 3, 1, 7. At the base of the stem, the number stopped and the word began. Remember. He turned it over in his hand. The key pulsed faintly with warmth, like it had been held recently, or like it had just been dreaming. Then he saw it. Inside the compartment, at the very back, something glimmered. Another sigil. This one carved into the stone itself. Deeper, older, not a crescent, a spiral, like a gear or a clock or an eye turned inward. He reached toward it, but the moment his fingers grazed the edge, the air in the tower shifted. The lamp guttered, and behind him, something groaned. Slow, mechanical, alive. Elliot spun around. One of the larger gears near the bell loft had moved, just a fraction. But it had moved, and beneath his feet, the entire tower gave a soft creak, like an old house stretching after a long sleep. He stepped back from the compartment, the key still in his hand, the sigil fading into shadow behind him. Something was waking, and the key he now held wasn't meant to open a door, it was meant to keep one shut. The next morning brought no sun, only gray skies and a slow drizzle that whispered over rooftops and soaked the cobblestones of Bellmare. The fog had retreated slightly, but the air still felt dense, like breath held in a quiet room. Elliot walked the narrow streets beneath his umbrella, the iron key tucked safely in his coat pocket. He hadn't slept after the events in the tower. Instead, he'd sat through the night at the workbench, rereading his grandfather's notes again and again, searching for something, a clue, a name, a pattern, anything that might explain the strange sigils or the deep spiral carved into the stone. But there was one place left to look, one person who might remember. Bellmare's library stood at the far end of the town square, hidden behind ivy and hedges. It was one of the oldest buildings in town, older than the tower, some claimed, and it smelled of damp pages and dust even in summer. Few people visited anymore. Fewer still remembered who kept it open. Elliot pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. A small brass bell above the door gave a gentle chime. The air inside was still and warm. Rows of tall wooden shelves lined the walls, and narrow walkways disappeared into shadows between them. It felt like entering a cathedral of forgotten knowledge. And behind the front desk, as always, sat the librarian. Her name was Miss Vesper. No one ever called her anything else. She was tall and slender, with silver hair tied back in a braid and eyes the color of ash. She looked up as Elliot approached, though she hadn't yet looked at the door. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said softly, not smiling. Elliot paused. "You know who I am." "Everyone does," she replied. "You have his eyes." He reached into his coat and placed the key on the counter between them. Her expression darkened slightly, as though a candle had gone out behind her eyes. "You opened the compartment," she said. Elliot nodded. "What is it? What does it mean?" Miss Vesper didn't speak at first. She reached beneath the counter and withdrew a small black volume, slim, bound in leather, and sealed with a wax thread. She placed it beside the key and untied the cord. Inside were symbols, not writing, not in any language Elliot recognized, just rows and rows of marks, spirals, crescents, lines drawn between stars. At the bottom of each page, a single sentence written in delicate ink. "The bell is not a chime, it is a signal." Miss Vesper looked up at him. The tower wasn't built to keep time. It was built to keep it out. Elliot frowned. Keep what out? She closed the book gently. "There is a theory," she said, her voice low, "that time is not a river, but a tide. That it can recede, return, and rise too far. That in certain places, if left unguarded, the tide comes in and never leaves." She gestured toward the key. "That is not a key for a door. It is a key for a lock, a barrier. Your grandfather sealed something inside the tower, and now you've begun to unseal it." Elliot felt the weight of the key in his coat once more. "I didn't mean to. No one ever means to," she said gently. "But now that it's stirred, you must watch the tower. Every night, you must listen." "Listen for what?" Miss Vesper looked toward the tall arched windows of the library. The rain had grown heavier. The fog had returned. "When the bell rings again," she said, "you'll know." He turned to leave, the shadows of the library swallowing his footsteps. Outside, the tower stood in the distance, its hands still frozen. But something behind its face was breathing. The fog returned before sunset. It rolled in from the hills like an animal, slow, silent, and oddly deliberate. It hugged the corners of buildings, pressed against windows, and pooled at doorsteps like it was looking for a way in. Even the birds went quiet. The entire town of Bellmare felt caught in a moment just before something happened. Elliot stood outside the clockmaker's shop, watching the mist gather at the base of the tower. From this close, the tower didn't look broken. It looked patient. He had spent most of the afternoon rereading the librarian's book. The pages made little sense. Most were symbols and diagrams, but certain patterns were beginning to emerge. Circles, repetitions, times, and always. The number 3. 3 turns to the lock, 3 points on the crescent, 3 chimes. If the bell tolled again, what would happen on the 3rd? He turned from the fog and stepped back inside the workshop. The pocket watch sat on the workbench, the notebook beside it, both unchanged, but the air in the room felt different now. Thicker, slower. He lit the lantern and moved to the staircase. Tonight, he would watch the tower. He climbed in silence, each step familiar now. The brass rail was cool beneath his hand. The gear chamber greeted him with the same dusty stillness, but Elliot didn't stop there. He climbed to the bell loft, where the sky beyond the windows had turned to steel. He settled into the stool, the one his grandfather must have used, and rested the lantern beside him. From here, the view of the town was strange. The fog blurred the shapes below, stretching the light from house windows into long, pale streaks. Bellmare looked softer, like something painted in watercolors and left in the rain. And then, somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. Not the tower bell, a smaller one, a chime. Elliot rose from the stool. The sound had come from the street below. He leaned toward the archway and listened. Another chime, then another. 3 in total. The fog parted for just a moment, revealing a figure on the street. It stood still, too still, at the edge of the square. Tall, shadowed, no features visible beneath its wide-brimmed hat and long coat. Just the shape of it, waiting beside a lamppost that hadn't worked in years. Elliot blinked. The figure was gone. Only the fog remained. He stepped back from the arch and turned toward the great bell. The lantern beside it flickered, the flame leaning sharply to one side as though caught in a sudden gust. But the air was still. He descended the stairs quickly, passing the gear chamber. At the bottom of the staircase, he froze. The clocks in the workshop, the old ones, the broken ones, were ticking. Not in unison, not loudly, just faintly, like the echo of a memory. Tick, tick, tick. And then, all at once, they stopped. Elliot stood in the silence, heart pounding, the fog pressing against the windows like a tide returning to shore. Bellmare was no longer just resting. It was listening. The cellar beneath the workshop had always been locked. Elliot remembered asking about it once as a boy. His grandfather had shaken his head, not unkindly, and said simply, "That part of the house isn't for you." Now, standing before the door at the base of the back staircase, Elliot thought those words had a different meaning. It wasn't so much a warning as a delay. The iron key he'd found inside the clock's sealed compartment, the one engraved with the word "Remember," slid into the lock like it had been waiting all along. The tumblers clicked, the door creaked inward, and the cold met him like a breath. The cellar was shallow and narrow, with stone walls and a low ceiling. Dust covered the floor in a thick velvet coat. The air smelled of damp wood and old oil. A single bulb swung from a wire in the ceiling, barely illuminating the shelves that lined the far wall. But what caught Elliot's eye first was the desk. It sat in the center of the room, cloaked in a faded drop cloth. He pulled the fabric back slowly, revealing a wide wooden surface scarred by use. Knife marks, ink stains, heat rings from teacups long evaporated. And across the desk, pinned with rusted tacks and delicate care, were sketches. Hundreds of them, they layered the desk like a collage of thought. Some torn, some yellowed, some rolled at the corners. Elliot leaned closer, careful not to disturb them. The drawings were of gears at first, simple ones, diagrams of the clock's mechanisms, blueprints in his grandfather's hand. But as he moved across the table, the sketches changed. Gears began to spiral into impossible shapes, curves that fed into themselves, teeth that turned both forward and backward. And then came the symbols, circles, crescents, stars inside eyes. Each sketch was accompanied by notes, scribbled in the margins. Phase 3 approaches. Do not allow alignment. The pendulum swings, but not for time. 317 is not an hour. It is a seal. Near the bottom corner of the desk, Elliot found a page folded neatly in thirds. He opened it and found a sketch of the bell tower itself, not as it was now, but surrounded by light. Lines radiated from it in all directions. The clock face was replaced with an open eye, and at the base of the drawing, final toll equals release. Elliot swallowed. He turned slowly to the shelves behind him. At first glance, they seemed to hold only old tools and broken parts. Coils of wire, lantern oil, rusted chisels, but on the middle shelf sat a tin box labeled simply Chrono. Inside were more notes. Some were journal entries, others letters never sent. And tucked at the very bottom, brittle, folded and sealed with wax, was another envelope. This one was addressed not to Elliot, but to the tower itself, to the one that listens. He didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he rose from the desk and looked once more at the sketches, the spirals, the eye, the tower surrounded by light. If the final toll was a release, then everything his grandfather had done, the sealing, the silence, the warnings, had been to prevent that sound. And now the clock was shifting again. The bell hadn't rung yet, but it would. And when it did, something inside the tower would no longer be dreaming. It would be awake. Elliot didn't remember falling asleep. He had returned from the cellar, the envelope still sealed in his coat pocket, and sat in the armchair beside the workshop hearth. A small, seldom-used fireplace that smelled of char and wax. He must have drifted off sometime after midnight. But when he opened his eyes, something was wrong. The clocks had moved, all of them, each one. The wall clocks, the pocket watches, even the broken mantelpiece model with no back panel, all showed the same time. 4:17 a.m. Elliot sat up, rubbing his eyes. The last time he had checked, it was just after 3. He reached for the notebook, flipping to a page where he'd started recording timestamps. He had written the time before, closing his eyes. 3:15 a.m., 2 minutes before the hour. 2 minutes before the moment Bellmare had frozen decades ago. And now, the clocks had jumped past it. He stood quickly and crossed the room to the window. The fog outside was heavy, but not unusual. The town square was dark and empty, but something about the air felt cleaner, not fresher exactly, just less still, like a breath had been exhaled after being held for too long. He checked his wristwatch. 4:17 a.m., the pocket watch on the table. 4:17. The clock on the wall. 4:17. He went to the tower. Lantern in hand, he climbed the stairs. The wood creaked beneath his boots, groaning softly with each step, as if the boards were remembering an old rhythm. At the gear chamber, he stopped. The gears had shifted. Not turning, not yet. But the alignment had changed. Certain cogs were closer than before. A flywheel that had sat stiff in its frame now rocked ever so slightly, like a toothless jaw working in sleep. Elliot turned toward the clock face. Light from the overcast dawn filtered in a pale blue through the stained glass. The minute hand pointed forward. Not much, but more than yesterday. And in the quiet, he noticed something else. A ticking, faint, not mechanical, rhythmic. He moved closer to the wall and placed his palm against the stone. It was warm again. Beneath it, behind the sealed compartment, something beat. Not fast, not frantic, just steady. A pulse. And then, a sound. Not the bell. Not yet. A creak. Below. He rushed down the stairs and into the workshop, eyes scanning the space. And there, beside the hearth, he found it. The envelope. The one addressed to the one that listens. It was gone. He turned in a slow circle, heart pounding in his ears. No broken windows, no open doors. Only one thing had changed. Every clock in the room, every watch and chime now ticked together. Softly. Tick, tick, tick. And with each tick, Elliot realized something terrifying. He had no memory of the past hour. The entire span between 3:15 and 4:17 was gone. Like time had skipped, like the tower had eaten it, and something had been fed. It was a sound he couldn't unhear, that soft, low ticking that now lived in the walls. Not from a single clock or gear, but from everywhere, as if the entire tower had developed a pulse. It wasn't constant. It came and went, sometimes near, sometimes far, like footsteps circling just out of sight. That evening, Elliot returned to the tower before dusk. He couldn't wait any longer. Something was shifting, and he could feel it in the bones of the old stone. A pattern was forming, and it wasn't just mechanical. It was ritual. He climbed the stairs with purpose now, lantern in one hand, notebook in the other. The creaks in the steps sounded sharper, more defined. Above him, the bell chamber loomed quiet, but it no longer felt asleep. It felt like a room holding its breath. At the gear chamber, he paused. There, on the work table his grandfather had bolted into the wall, was a small metal case. It hadn't been there the night before. Elliot opened it slowly. Inside, he found a handful of antique winding keys, a piece of broken chain, and something that made him freeze. A page, torn from the notebook, but he hadn't removed any pages. The writing was his grandfather's, rushed and jagged, as though written in haste. The steps are listening. Do not walk in circles. Do not turn twice. He turned slowly, instinctively looking to the stairs behind him. They curled upward as they always had. But for a split second, he thought he saw something, a shadow, moving up the steps. He followed, heart pounding, reaching the bell loft just as the sky darkened from gray to blue. The fog below was denser tonight, coating the rooftops in a pale silence. He waited. Nothing moved. He turned back toward the bell and stopped. Someone had written on the inner wall of the tower, just behind the rope, a line of chalky white, old, faint, but still visible. The bell tolls for those who listen. He raised his lantern. There were more, dozens of them, some written over each other, some upside down, some scratched into the stone. Words, names, times, repeated phrases. 3:17. Do not answer. They are watching from behind the face. Time opens inward. Elliot stepped back, his breath fogging in the cold air. The bell loomed above him, quiet and heavy. And then, from below, somewhere between the workshop and the chamber, he heard it. Footsteps. 1 dot, 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 2 dots. 3 dots. Then silence. He waited, straining to hear. A faint creak. Closer. He called out, "Who's there?" No answer. Just the soft tap of movement on old stairs. Not running, not stumbling. Walking, as if whoever, or whatever it was, had all the time in the world. Elliot gripped the lantern tighter and descended quickly, boots echoing against the stone. But as he reached the gear chamber, the footsteps stopped, and on the table, where the metal case had been, was something new. The envelope, the one that had vanished, unsealed, empty. Only one word had been written on the flap now, in small, careful letters. Soon. The next morning, Bellmare was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence that follows a snowfall or settles on a sleepy town at dusk. This was heavier, as though something had been taken away and left nothing in its place. Elliot stepped out into the square just after dawn. The fog clung lower than usual, hugging the bricks and chimneys. The bakery across the street hadn't opened. The windows of the apothecary remained dark. Even the birds seemed to have vanished from the rooftops. Then he saw her. Agnes Hulling stood in the center of the square, alone, her coat wrapped tightly around her thin frame. She didn't look up when he approached. "She's gone," she said softly. Elliot stopped. "Who?" Agnes turned slowly. Her eyes were tired, but not afraid. She looked like someone who had seen this before. The miller's daughter, Lily. She vanished in the night. Her window was still locked. No signs of a struggle. But she's gone. He felt a chill creep down his back. "You think she left on her own?" Agnes shook her head. She said something strange the day before. Told her mother a man in the bell tower had whispered to her. Elliot stared. "No one's been up there but me." "Are you sure?" Agnes asked, her voice low. Because she said he had a voice like a wind-up toy, said he told her things. Secrets about the stars, and about how time doesn't end. It folds. Elliot remembered the notebook. The phrases repeated like prayers. Fold, loops, spirals. She said, Agnes continued, that he asked her to listen. Just listen. That's all it takes. Agnes pulled something from her coat pocket and handed it to him. It was a small brass gear, old, dented, with teeth worn smooth. A child might mistake it for a toy. "We found that in her bed," Agnes said, still warm. Elliot looked up at the tower. The hands on the clock face had moved again. Just slightly. A breath forward. He returned to the workshop without speaking. The door groaned behind him as it shut, and the quiet of the shop seemed deeper than before. The clocks no longer ticked. They watched. Elliot placed the brass gear beside the envelope on the workbench and sat down. He opened the notebook once more, turning pages until he reached one he didn't recognize. It hadn't been there the night before. A single line written in his grandfather's hand. "They come for the listeners first." He closed the book. Outside, the tower stood tall in the mist, and somewhere inside its winding stone, a soft voice whispered something that sounded like a name. Lily. It happened just before dawn. Elliot had returned from another sleepless night. The workshop was cold, the lamps unlit. The clocks had all gone still again. No ticking, no shifting, only silence. A silence so thick it seemed to press against the skin. He had almost convinced himself the tower was sleeping once more. And then the bell rang. Just once. It wasn't loud. Not like the old stories said. Not like the way the bell used to chime across the rooftops of Bellmare. No, this sound was different. Software, almost gentle, as though the bell had been waiting for the perfect moment to speak again, and had chosen a whisper over a shout. The sound curled down the tower like a ribbon of smoke, drifted through the cracks in the floorboards, and slid beneath the doors of every house in Bellmare. Elliot froze. The ring lasted no more than a second, a single shimmering note. But it stayed in the air, like the echo had nowhere to go. He stepped outside. The square was still empty, no windows lit, no movement in the street. And yet, every light in the tower was glowing, not with fire, not with electricity, with something colder. The fog around the base of the tower pulsed faintly with each breath of light, inhaling, exhaling. The air shimmered, and the mist seemed to bend around the building. He looked up. The hands on the clock face now pointed clearly to 3:18. It had moved again, and this time the hour was no longer frozen. Elliot climbed the tower steps slowly, each one creaking underfoot as though warning him back. When he reached the bell loft, the lanterns hanging from the beams had already lit themselves. No flame, just a glow. The bell hung above him, unmoving, but beneath it, a shadow. He stepped forward. On the stone floor was a mark, not drawn, but burned. A spiral. Clean, perfect, etched into the stone like a brand. At the center of the spiral sat the missing brass gear, the same one from Lily's bed. Only now, it ticked, once every few seconds, not loudly, but with purpose. He bent to pick it up, and stopped. The spiral beneath it was warm. He didn't touch it. Instead, he turned and descended the tower, breath shallow, hands shaking. At the base, Agnes Holling stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. "You heard it too," she said. Elliot nodded. "One ring," she whispered. "That was always the first sign. In the stories, 1 ring to wake it, 2 to call it, 3 to open the gate." He looked at her. Open what? She didn't answer, only looked past him, up the tower, where the bell had tolled once, and time had heard its name. The ticking began that evening, not from the clocks in the shop. Those had long since fallen still again. No, this ticking came from the tower itself. A soft, wet sound, like gears turning through sap or honey. It came in irregular pulses, echoing faintly down the spiral staircase as though something far above had begun to stir and stretch. Elliot sat at the workbench, staring at the brass gear that had reappeared after Lily's disappearance. It still ticked once every few seconds, despite having no mechanism, no teeth left to grip. Just a shell of what it once was. Like the tower itself. He had tried writing, charting out time signatures, drawing spirals, comparing the shifts in the clock hands, but none of it made sense. None of it fit. Until the whispers began. At first, they came only when he stood near the sealed wall of the gear chamber, just behind the hidden compartment, the one where he had found the key. They were faint, like wind through a pipe, but if he stood still, and very, very quiet, he could hear words, not clear, not human, mechanical, distant, a scraping rhythm behind the voice, like breath pulled through a rusted grate. He went to the wall and pressed his hand against it. The stone was warm, not as before, not subtly. It throbbed, like a pulse, a second heartbeat beneath the tower's skin. He listened. The whispers grew louder, not just behind the wall now, but from within the gears. He stepped into the chamber, lantern held low, and saw that the great flywheel, once dormant, was now spinning slowly. A silent rotation, like a thought forming in the dark. The voices wove through the movement, not language exactly, but pattern. Repetition. Elliot. He froze. It had said his name. Elliot. This time it wasn't a whisper, it was a breath. The flywheel slowed. A hiss of pressure escaped the lower chamber. Elliot turned toward the spiral staircase and stopped. A shadow moved just below on the landing near the first floor. It wasn't Agnes. It wasn't anyone. The figure was tall and bent, as though folded to fit inside the tower. Its limbs were long, its head tilted slightly to one side. He couldn't see its face, just the shape, and the feeling, like the memory of being watched as a child. The shadow didn't move. It waited. So did Elliot. Then the voice came again, not from the wall, not from the gears, but from inside his head. Not words this time. Only one clear idea. Come closer. He didn't. He backed up the steps slowly, returning to the bell loft. His hands trembled. The lantern flickered. Above him, the great bell began to hum. Not ring. Human. A low tone, vibrating the bones in his chest. He placed the gear down on the floor of the loft. It stopped ticking. The humming stopped. The shadow was gone. He turned in a circle. Nothing. Only silence. But as he descended again, one phrase rang in his ears, left behind by the whisper behind the gears. If it turns 3 times, you will not leave. Elliot spent the following day in silence. He didn't speak, didn't write. Barely moved from the bench in the workshop, save to breathe, drink tea gone cold, or stare at the window. Outside, the fog had settled once more, thick and unmoving, not drifting, but pressed against the glass like hands waiting for a signal. No one passed by. The square was empty. Even the cats were gone. Only the clocks kept him company, silent, still, but attentive. He could feel their gaze now, not eyes exactly, but presence, as though they were no longer measuring time but watching it, watching him. He knew the tower was changing. Its heart beat now, not fast, not steady, but alive. And beneath it, behind the stone and brass and hush of years, something remembered its name. He returned to the cellar at dusk. The lantern flame quivered in his hand as he descended the stairs, the shadows curling tighter with every step. He hadn't returned since finding the sketches, the spiral, the phrase. Final toll equals release. The papers were still there, untouched. But something else waited now. On the desk, placed squarely at the center, was the notebook. Open to a page he had never seen. The handwriting was his grandfather's, but not like the others. It was cleaner, smoother, as though written carefully, with a final effort of will. The title at the top read, "If I Forget Myself." Elliot sat down, heart in his throat. He read, "I'm not writing this for myself. By the time these words are found, I will already have forgotten how many nights I've spent in the tower. How many times I wound the mechanism not to keep time, but to hold it in place. Time is not a line. It is a loop, a snare, and the bell is not a chime. It is the knot at the center. I stopped it once, but I could not seal it. Because something watches from the inside. Every tick is a breath. Every breath, a memory. The clock remembers things we've forgotten, days that did not happen, hours that repeat, people who vanished between 1 second and the next. I write this now before I forget Lily. She has come to me in dreams. She listens too closely now. If the bell tolls again, if it rings 3 times, I will not be here to stop it. I can only leave the tools, the warnings, the watchful clocks. To you, Elliot, my boy, the last who remembers. Do not wind it. Do not answer it. Do not step inside the spiral." His hands trembled as he reached the end. The page was dated. March 3rd, 3:17 a.m. The same hour, the same moment, the exact time the tower had frozen 70 years ago. He looked up. The cellar felt tighter now, the shadows closer. The notebook closed itself as the lantern flickered. And from far above, high in the bell loft, the rope moved. Not a lot, just enough to make a sound, a soft, whispering sway. And someone laughed, just once, a child's voice. Lily. It was just past midnight when Elliot lit the final lantern. The tower had grown colder, not in temperature, but in feeling, a deep, internal stillness that crept into the wood and the stone. The walls no longer whispered, the gears no longer stirred. Even the soft hum beneath the floorboards had gone silent, as though the tower itself was holding its breath. He sat alone in the gear chamber, the notebook open beside him, his grandfather's final warning playing over and over in his mind. Do not wind it, do not answer it, do not step inside the spiral. But the key still burned in his coat pocket. The same key he had found weeks ago, tucked behind the sealed compartment, shaped like a crescent around a glass eye. It was made to fit one lock, the central core beneath the bell. A lock designed not to open something, but to hold it closed. He removed the cover from the gear housing, revealing the tower's heart, the central drum, wound tight with ancient tension. The brass looked soft in the lantern light, its surface worn smooth from decades of turning. But now it was unmoving. He slipped the key into the mechanism. It fit perfectly. He didn't turn it. Not yet. Instead, he reached for the notebook and laid his hand over the drawing of the spiral, the same one carved into the floor of the bell loft. Final toll equals release. But something else caught his eye now. Something he hadn't noticed before. Tiny symbols drawn into the outer edge of the spiral. Not decorative, mathematical, tally marks. There were two. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The bell had tolled once. The tower had hummed. The rope had moved. Was that the second? Were these the tallies? Had the tower already counted two? The rules were clear. 1 ring to wake it, 2 to call it, 3 dots, 3 to open the gate. His hand hovered over the key. And then, from above, a sudden sound. Not the bell. A snap. Like metal giving way. He rushed up the stairs, lantern swinging, breath fogging in the cold. The bell loft was glowing again. Not from flame, but from the spiral itself. The marking on the floor pulsed with a dim golden light, like embers curling in slow motion. The rope swayed, and at the edge of the chamber stood Lily, or something that had once been Lily. She looked the same pale dress, same dark hair, but her eyes, they were turning, spiraling inward, slowly, like the hands of the tower clock. "Elliot," she whispered, "you're late." He stepped back, nearly stumbling over the lantern. "You're not real," he said. "You're not her." She tilted her head, her smile too still. "Not anymore," she said. Behind her, the bell creaked. A second chime, low and distant, echoed faintly through the stones. Not a real toll. A memory of one. It hadn't rung, but it had wanted to. She stepped forward. "You brought the key," she said. "You opened the lock. You're part of it now." Elliot gripped the railing. "I didn't mean to." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They never do." Then she vanished, Not like a ghost. Not with a flicker. Just gone, as if someone had skipped a second on the clock. The bell loft was empty, but at the center of the spiral, the brass gear ticked once, and Elliot understood. The tower was winding itself, and soon it wouldn't need a key. It began at exactly 3:17 a.m., the moment the tower had frozen all those years ago. The moment etched into every clock face, every page of Harold Remley's notebook, every whispered warning Elliot had ignored until now. The first chime rang deep and low, shaking the glass in the windows and the gears in the floor. Then came the second, then the third. He didn't run. He didn't move. He stood in the center of the bell loft, the spiral glowing faintly at his feet, the brass key clenched in his palm like a wound. The bell had begun to toll, but it didn't stop at 3. It rang again, 4, 5, 6. Each chime stretched longer than the last, echoing through the stone and wood of the tower, through the fog-soaked town below. The sound passed through walls and windows, through skin and bone. 7, 8. Elliot dropped to his knees. With every strike of the bell, visions burst behind his eyes. Memories not his own. The first time his grandfather wound the tower, the day the mechanism locked itself. A child swallowed by a ticking door. The old librarian closing her eyes as the fog drifted into her lungs. 9, 10, 11, and still the bell rang. Outside, Bellmare held its breath. Time slipped. In one window, candles burned backward into wax. In another, a mirror reflected a room that no longer existed. The fog bled upward, curling around the tower like fingers. 12. 13. Elliot gritted his teeth, pressing the key into the spiral, hoping it might stop, that it might anchor him to something real. It didn't. 14. 15. The notebook lay open beside him now, pages fluttering in a wind that didn't exist. The handwriting blurred, ink bled, words rearranged themselves. 16. 17. And then, silence. No breath, no sound, just stillness. And then, 18. The bell shook the air. The floor split. The spiral cracked, its light surging outward like golden smoke. 19. Elliot screamed, but no one heard, not even himself. The sound was swallowed as if time no longer allowed it. The final chime came slowly. 20. It didn't ring. It spoke. Not in words, not in voice, but in memory. It showed him Bellmare, not as it was, but as it had always been. A boundary, a barrier, a wound stitched shut with cogs and silence. The bell wasn't a warning, it was a seal, and it had broken. As the final tone faded into the spiral, the tower exhaled. Not air, not fog, but time. Poured out like water from a cracked glass, drifting into the town below. And Elliot, standing in the heart of the mechanism, understood the truth. The bell had never meant to tell time. It had meant to contain it. And now, it no longer could. The morning after the bell rang 20 times, Bellmare woke into stillness. Not silence, stillness. A hush that went beyond sound. The fog had vanished. The tower no longer glowed. The clocks in the shop were quiet again, but not in the way they had been. Their stillness now felt complete. Not paused, but ended. Elliot stood at the top of the tower, his coat wrapped tightly around him against the wind that no longer blew. The spiral on the floor had faded, leaving only a faint scorch mark where it once pulsed. The brass gear was gone. So was the rope. So was Lily. He hadn't seen her again. He hadn't needed to. The door in time, whatever it had been, had opened. Then it had closed. The 20 chimes hadn't destroyed the tower. They had emptied it. The pressure that had built for 70 years was gone, like a breath released, finally allowed to fall away into the fog. Bellmare was quiet now. Streets unbroken, windows whole. People moving slowly, uncertain why they felt like they'd just woken from a long, strange dream. Most didn't remember the night before. A few did, the old ones. The ones who'd lived here when the tower still rang. Agnes Holling, Miss Vesper, a boy with one green eye who hadn't spoken in years, but now hummed gently as he walked. They didn't speak of the tower. They didn't need to. Elliot returned to the workshop later that day. The clocks still lined the shelves, but none ticked. He didn't wind them. He didn't need to. He opened his grandfather's notebook one final time. On the last page, a new line had appeared, not written by his grandfather, not by him, by the tower. "Thank you for watching." He left the page open and stepped outside. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. The shadow of the tower stretched long across the cobblestones. Still tall, still silent, but no longer holding its breath. He stood for a moment, listening. Not for ticking, not for bells, just for life. And in that moment, he heard only what mattered. Wind, birds, the creak of old shutters. A town remembering how to move forward, slowly, gently. Time uncoiled. He turned the key in the door one last time and locked the workshop behind him. He did not take the key with him. It belonged here now. The tower would sleep again, and if it ever woke, someone else would hear it. Until then, the clocks would stay still, and Bellmare would forget. That too was a kind of mercy.